week is Michael Shellenberger. He is the sorry, I'll need to restart there, Ramon, but it's fine. We'll just edit that out. Did you say President Environmental Progress, eh? Mike?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our guest this week is Michael Shellenberger. He is the President of Environmental Progress and a Time Magazine Hero of the Environment. And someone we've been trying to get on the show for a very long time. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, we really want to chat to you. You're very involved in advocacy around energy, and we wanted to have a really frank discussion. We have a lot of discussions on the show where we try to give listeners as many of the facts, as much of the evidence around different subjects. And I find when I'm debating with people around energy, when I'm discussing what the best forms of energy are, the safest, the cheapest, you can't have everything, but there's a lot of misinformation there around everything from fossil fuels to nuclear to renewables. So perhaps let's start off with how you got interested in energy in the first place.
Well, I was originally concerned with nuclear, as someone growing up in the late 70s, early 80s, I was sort of taught to be afraid of nuclear. At the very end of the Cold War, there's a lot of fear of nuclear war with Russia. And then the Cold War ended. And as an environmentalist, I became concerned, like a lot of people, with climate change. It's climate similar to fears of nuclear weapons in that they both seem like apocalyptic problems. And so for a young, kind of idealistic, left-wing kind of person, I was drawn to the climate issue in the same way that I was drawn to concerns around nuclear. And I was working on it it must have been for what I think almost a decade or a little bit less than a decade, when really promoting renewables, solar and wind, when it became clear that it was going to be very hard to scale up solar and wind, really for two reasons. The first was just the difficulty of dealing with their essentially unreliable nature. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, which means you always have to have some other source of energy ready to come online when that happens. And then the second was just the large environmental impacts that they were having, particularly in California, where we were building these huge solar farms in the deserts and having to kill a lot of threatened species, and also the wind farms, similarly killing a lot of really big birds and bats, not common robins or sparrows, but eagles and hawks and owls, kestrels. And it started to dawn on us that there were sort of underlying physical problems with renewables. In order to generate significant amounts of energy from sunlight and wind, which are highly dilute, you have to spread solar panels and wind turbines over a huge amount of area. And so that fact and the unreliability mean that renewables are inherently going to make electricity really expensive and have really big environmental impacts.
Let's talk a little bit about this concept of dilute and concentrated energy. It does sound very straightforward. You do talk about it quite a bit, but just for those who've never come across these concepts, just talk to us a little bit about these types of energy and what difference it makes when you're trying to invest in them.
I mean, the easiest way to think about it is just to compare wood and coal to oil and then eventually uranium. So, I mean, the reason that coal is how poor countries develop is because there's so much more energy in a lump of coal than there is in a lump of wood. And so you can generate a lot more power going, with burning coal than burning wood. That's how Britain developed in the late 1700s or 1700s. Obviously, poor countries, including South Africa, are burning coal in order to lift its people out of poverty. And then when you go from coal to oil, you have 2 to 3 times more energy in that amount of oil than you do in the coal. But then the really big jump is from oil or natural gas to uranium. And the difference is that when you're burning a fossil fuel, you're chemically splitting the molecules. But when you go to uranium and atomic fission, you're splitting the atoms. And so you're releasing this huge quantity of energy that is bound up in uranium atoms. It's actually bound up in every atom. The difference is that uranium atoms are so heavy that they are already pretty unstable and easy to split. And when you do that, it releases heat, and you have basically somewhere like 1,000,000 times more energy per unit of uranium than you do in petroleum.
And of course, renewables are very dilute. They're almost going backwards in a way, in the sense that less so than coal, even in terms of harnessing them.
Yeah, for sure they are. I mean, sunlight and wind, it just requires covering huge amounts of land. I mean, to give you one statistic, so in California it's very sunny. So if you compare the amount of electricity we get from our nuclear plants, how much land would you have to cover, with solar to get the same amount of electricity? It's 450 times more land. 450 times more land to get the same amount of electricity from solar as nuclear. Well, if you're trying to protect wild areas, wilderness, whether it's our landscapes or your landscapes in South Africa, if you want to protect wildlife or traditional communities or whatever, you don't want to be covering it with energy production. The whole point is to save the environment, is not to use it. So the crazy thing is, how is it that people that claim to be trying to save the environment found themselves advocating a sort of energy which is so terrible for the environment?
Yeah, that's quite true, Michael. But before we get into specifics about certain types of energy, I actually want to get into your philosophy. So you are, maybe you still call yourself an eco-modernist. And it appears that term riles people on the left and the right. So therefore, that's why we chose you to come onto the podcast, because that's interesting. That if a lot of people dislike you for the same fundamental reason, you might be doing something right. So if you look at what the UN says and what a lot of people in the environmental movement say, there's a sort of Malthusian element to it. Humans are parasites, and we need to stop development, and we need to do various things to save the planet. Eco-modernism seems to be doing, something completely different entirely. So if you had to succinctly define eco-modernism and your philosophy around it, how would you do that?
I mean, basically, the human progress is identical to environmental progress. So there's not a trade-off, especially at the big levels. I mean, there might be at sort of local levels. I guess you might sort of say there's some situations where you might spend less money on pollution control. But basically, when you go from wood to coal to natural gas to oil to uranium, you're both improving the natural environment and you're driving economic growth. So the idea that we needed to do less economic growth to solve environmental problems was, as you said, sort of an idea invented in the 1960s by people who were opposed to nuclear and really other forms of low-cost energy, because they thought it would create overpopulation. Too many people, a cancer on the earth. And so that was the origins of opposition to nuclear. Nuclear was what everybody understood would be this incredibly abundant. There's really no resource constraint to nuclear. There's endless quantities of uranium. You never run out of it. So the threat that nuclear posed to dystopian, anti-humanistic, Malthusian people was precisely that it was a way that humans could thrive and prosper without hurting the environment. I mean, I wrote this piece recently called "The Reason They Hate Nuclear is Because It Means We Don't Need Renewables." The whole justification for spending more money on energy, for doing renewables, doesn't hold when you have nuclear. If you have nuclear, you don't want or need to do renewables. And that's why they don't like it. They want, I think this is the critique from the right of the environmental movement, and I think it's essentially correct, which is that most environmentalists are looking to control society. It doesn't have anything to do with the environment. They're looking for ways to control how people eat, what people drive, how they get around. And energy is sort of the master resource. So trying to get control over the energy system is really a way to get power for yourself and your political coalitions and the society.
Yeah, quite. But at a fundamental level, is climate change, as they call it these days, do you think yourself it is an existential threat to humanity and the planet?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, I have to say, my attitude is that to that question is it's sort of like it depends. I mean, the short version of that is if the world was scaling up nuclear plants at the rate that France and Sweden were in the 1980s, then I probably wouldn't be very worried at all about climate change, and I certainly wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. But if the world's not going to do nuclear and is just going to build coal plants, I have more concerns about climate change, and my concerns go up at higher temperatures. I mean, just sort of common sense, but also there's a lot of science suggesting that hotter temperatures create more risks. Does it mean that we could go extinct if it gets too hot? Hard to see it. But the people that would end up suffering the most are the people you would imagine. They're people that are the poorest people in the world. They're people that depend on, small farmers in places like Africa. So I think it's one of those things where I think those of us that are rich and live in rich societies and have a lot of energy and development are going to be much less vulnerable to the greater risks of climate change than those who are not.
All right. Thanks, Ramon. You've now got insight into into Mark's sort of deeper beliefs. But let's talk a little bit about nuclear. You're saying nuclear is a solution. I happen to agree with you, but I know I often encounter discussions with people, and this is a very hot topic on social media. The minute you sort of say anything sort of pro-nuclear, you get a lot of reaction. I'm sure your timeline is lit up most of the time, whereby basically you say nuclear and you get a lot of stuff thrown at you. So first thing is nuclear creates waste. And you can do nothing with that waste, and so that's a very bad thing. That's the one argument. The other argument is, well, it's nuclear, so it therefore is dangerous to people, just in general, and it presents sort of this existential threat. And then, of course, the examples that come up are things like Chernobyl, things like the meltdown at Fukushima, and really just a lot of scaremongering. And it's not to say that there's no danger or implicit danger in any technology, really, but to understand the risk versus benefit of any specific technology. So how do you respond to those critiques?
Well, I mean, the short version is just that nuclear is literally one of the safest technologies that's ever existed. Not just the safest way to make electricity, it's literally one of the safest one of the safest technologies. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean, if you look at all the science, it looks like nuclear will have killed about 200 people in total by 2050. By contrast, 7 million people die every year from burning fossil fuels and biomass, according to the World Health Organization. Some of my conservative friends, they think the World Health Organization exaggerates. Let's say that the World Health is exaggerating sevenfold, So just 1 million people die every year from air pollution. Well, so nobody dies from nuclear plant air pollution. Like more people die, falling out of bed, right, than die from nuclear. More people die from wind turbines killing them than nuclear. Don't take my word for it. These are all things that have been established in the science. More people die just walking down the street looking at this. I mean, more people have died in car accidents because of using smartphones, I believe, in 1 year than will ever die. So why? So then you kind of go, so if it's so safe, and by the way, the latest study showed it's actually saved 2 million lives just by preventing air pollution. If it's so safe, why are we so afraid of it? And I just think at the end of the day, it's because people are scared of nuclear weapons. They're scared of the bomb. But even that turned out not to be the big worry that everybody had, because as countries get nuclear weapons, they don't get invaded, and it basically has prevented war. Yeah, I mean, not just between the United States and the Soviet Union, but between the Soviet Union and China, and now we see in India and Pakistan. When Pakistan got the bomb, everybody said, well, there's going to be a nuclear war. All the experts said there's going to be a nuclear war between India and Pakistan. Well, what's happened? It's ended wars between India and Pakistan. So what it is it's a revolutionary technology It's so radical when you consider that a single year in time invented both the replacement of all fossil fuels and the end of war. And humans responded to that level of power in nuclear fission with some mixture of hope, horror, and fear, and hatred, because it meant that there would be a technical fix to all of these problems that throughout time humans have thought there should be social and political fixes for.
So, I mean, that's actually quite an interesting. I mean, the concept of mutually assured destruction is a real one. I think Thatcher agreed with it to a large part, and so did Reagan. The problem with nuclear is not the technology itself. I suppose, it's the type of state that wants to have nuclear energy, because it's not an easy thing to do. It's not cheap either. So, I mean, in your country, the Iran deal was a big issue, but even locally in South Africa, we were going to go nuclear, but it was so rife with corruption. The deal to go nuclear was so rife with corruption, and we could just sense that it's not done for the betterment of the country. It's done to grease palms and to essentially loot those contracts. So, I mean, do you have any sort of reactions to those sort of caveats to the nuclear question?
Well, I mean, so let me ask this. In every other domain of South African political life, is there no corruption? There was only corruption in the case of nuclear?
No, it's quite. It's spread far and wide. Its tentacles reach into basically almost every
Everything.
public sector transaction. Yes.
Right. So then why is the corruption somehow a problem with nuclear and not solar panels or wind turbines or coal or gas?
I think it was just about the extent. It was going to cost, at the time, about $90 billion, which is our annual GDP, I think. So it was the extent of it.
90 billion for, I mean, it's basically you were paying 90 billion for, or like, I mean, I think it was like, I mean, if you just round up, 100 billion for 100 gigawatts of power, that's basically the price. I mean, that's basically the global price. So, I mean, I'm a little bit like, was your former politicians, were they on the take? I don't know, probably. But I mean, was it the main driver of why? Nuclear it's like building a hydroelectric dam or highways or whatever. There's an upfront cost. I don't know that 100 billion was higher than it should have been. I think there might have been more corruption than there should have been. Any amount of corruption is too much. But I just kind of go, like, if you're going to make eliminating corruption in the world the necessary prerequisite to doing nuclear, then you're not going to do nuclear. And if you're going to make it the prerequisite for anything, you're not going to do it. So, I mean, I just kind of go, do as best as you can to fix your corruption problems, but don't let that get in the way of building a source of very cheap electricity for a country that's still struggling to lift everybody out of poverty.
I fully agree with you, but living here, I think, gives you a different perspective. So basically, the goal was to fund the governing party, which has been in power since '94, and they are generally quite a socialist party. The economy has basically declined for 10 years in a row. There's an investment strike. We are up to our eyeballs in debt, 60% of GDP or close to it. This would have pushed us into the abyss, economically speaking. And the deal would have funded the governing party for the next 2-3 decades and maybe made it a complete dictatorship of South Africa. So that was the clear and present danger
you don't want
of
nuclear
that.
because you don't want to support ANC. I just think you should, you're going to get coal instead. And somebody's going to be corrupt with coal, right? So,
in fact, we have tons of corruption with coal.
So, I don't know. Do you guys want to talk about that? Because, I kind of go, I know a lot about nuclear. I'm not an expert in South Africa's corruption situation. And I just kind of think they don't really have anything to do with each other. I'm kind of like, maybe you've got some particular, I could kind of go around the world and I've gone all around the world the last 3 years and I meet with various countries and they're all corrupt, by the way, all of them. And I've written the most, trying to be true to who I am, I've written the most on the corruption in my home state, including corruption around nuclear and gas. So I don't really know about how South Africa is corrupt, but everybody's corrupt, and there's all sorts of corruption. And at the end of the day, you have to decide what technology you want. And you know what I mean? So I just kind of go. I mean, I'm a little bit like, do you want me to comment about South Africa? It just seems it's not my area.
I do think one of the things that happens with nuclear is, for example, they'll say, well, the government here is not only corrupt, but they're quite incompetent. So everything they do fails, essentially. Or if they try to achieve something, they only ever get about 30, 40, at best 50% of the way there. So if they want to build a nuclear plant, people go, well, okay, maybe we can excuse the corruption, or we just accept that that's part of the deal. But building a nuclear plant up to 50% capacity, or only training the staff up to 50% capacity, seems like a bad idea at a nuclear plant. What's happened in terms of technology with nuclear to avoid a Chernobyl happening again?
Well, Chernobyl can't happen again for a variety of reasons, including just basic technologies. You know, that was a reactor that had no containment dome. The workers, I mean, this is, you know, it's over 35 years ago. But I just still kind of go, like, I think let's talk about Chernobyl. I mean, here you have like the worst.
Yeah, let's talk about
one of the worst industrial accidents in human history. The reactor had no containment dome. It was on fire. It shot blue neutrons up into the sky. You know, just this incredible display. It sprayed radioactive material all over Europe, and we can't see any increase in any cancer other than thyroid cancer. And thyroid cancer turns out to be incredibly easy to treat. Nobody should die from it. The only people that will die from it are people that didn't get health care, in which case you can attribute all the thyroid cancer deaths to health care, lack of health care. Radiation is just not what we thought it was. It's just at low levels. And low levels are still pretty high because you can get pretty high exposures. It's just not what we thought it was. I mean, some of the best studies were done out of Hiroshima and Nagasaki because you could tell, people could report where they were during the bombing, and we can measure how much radiation they got. Well, if you got 1,000 times more radiation than today's radiation limits at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, your chance of cancer went up, but it went up by 10%. And when you consider that 40% of people get cancer, you know, it's a pretty small increase. You know, the people that got that dose, they died earlier, but by 16 months. So, I mean, even at relatively high doses, we just don't see the disaster that we see with ordinary air pollution. So if you've ever been to Delhi, there's probably parts of South Africa that are like this. You're breathing all this particulate matter from burning wood and dung and fossil fuels. When you have the worst nuclear accident and a little bit of the radiant pollution escapes, it's just hardly any. It's not enough to affect anybody's bodies. So it's really, the accidents all have to be looked at as kind of a panic, a radiation panic, and a kind of moral panic.
It's interesting because with regards to Fukushima, for example, I often say to people that, you know, are they aware of the actual deaths that happened around Fukushima? And as far as I understand, there are very few related directly to the actual meltdown, if any. You can correct me on that. But I do know there were deaths related to the evacuation because people panicked and it happened in such a quick way. And specifically, I have an interest in healthcare, specifically the hospitals that they evacuated. Many of those patients ended up dying. Because they took ICU patients to basically gymnasiums outside of the containment zone. And that's obviously, an ICU patient doesn't belong in a gym. And so those patients then unfortunately demised. But if they just left those patients be where they were, they'd probably be fine.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you said it exactly. I mean, here they were pulling people out of nursing homes and hospitals. I mean, it's crazy. It was a panic. You know, and then people stayed away longer than they needed to, even though we had the radiation data. You know, so I mean, it all comes back to fear of the bomb, I think. You know, and I think because of course, you know, I told a story where when my son was 2, he got really sick. We didn't know what was wrong with him. We took him to the hospital. Well, first, what they did is they said, we want to give your son a spinal tap, which is this incredibly painful withdrawal of spinal fluid. They had to hold him down while he was screaming to pull out the spinal fluid. And I let them, of course. And then they said, we don't know what it is. Have him drink this radioactive liquid called barium. And at the time, I was pretty radiophobic. I was anti-nuclear. And so was my wife. And we said, well, is that safe? And the doctor said, oh, yeah, it's safe because it's a low level of radiation. So we let our son drink this radioactive liquid and then we put him under an X-ray machine. So why is it that we go to an institution like a hospital and we let our child have these incredible things done to him and have him have radiation by people that we've never met before, right? And yet, like, if a local nuclear plant wants to change the turbine or the steam generator or some banal piece of equipment, there's just gigantic hearings and public concern and all this just strum and drang about nuclear. Well, clearly it has to be about something other than what the thing is. It's the only thing that explains it. The science of this stuff is old, not new. The science of radiation, we've been studying radiation since the early 1900s. Marie Curie and her husband, he taped a piece of radium onto his skin because he wanted to see the health effects. So they were experimenting with radiation effects on health. So we have like 120 years of data on radiation effect on health. And yet we still spaz out every time a nuclear plant melts down and a tiny amount of uranium fuel escapes into the environment.
Yeah. You're very persuasive, Michael. Much more than I'm a pro-nuclear kind of guy, but you've made me a zealot within 26 minutes. But
it's not me. I tell I'm drawn to this issue in part because the first obvious issue is I think nuclear is the only way that you can lift everybody out of poverty and protect the environment. But the other thing I find so amazing about it, that I actually love about it, is that there's so much distance between the truth and people's perceptions. It's like people think it's literally the opposite of what it is, and they don't know what it is and how important it is. So I think that's what's so interesting about it. I'm just telling you, all of this stuff I'm telling you is stuff that's been out there for decades, but nobody has properly articulated it. In part, part of the problem is the nuclear industry itself is, for a variety of reasons we could talk about if you're interested, but it's just very bad at explaining its own technology.
Yeah. So in South Africa, for example, there is a very high level of pollution around our coal power stations. There was a study done a few weeks ago, and people are breathing in poisonous air to a degree that's much more harmful than whatever the mean is these days. So that came out. But post Fukushima, there was a massive drive, especially it appears in Europe and in Japan, to sort of decommission nuclear plants. And I think Germany now as well has said that they won't build or continue with several nuclear plants, and they're going to revert back to renewables and other sort of things. I hear what you are saying, and then I see what a lot of these bureaucrats are doing in Germany and Japan and even in France some of the time. I know that you said, is nuclear energy that difficult to understand, or is it just, or are the scientists not persuasive enough? Because you are quite persuasive. But why is there such a disconnect, generally speaking? What is it about the nuclear industry itself? Is there IP law that prevent them from talking about stuff?
No, it's nothing like that. No, it's a couple of different things. The first thing is banal, which is just engineers are terrible at talking about their products. They tend to, in the case of nuclear, because it's perceived as dangerous, there's a kind of macho engineering attitude within the industry that says, well, yes, little lady, nuclear energy is very dangerous, but good thing I'm such a darn good engineer that I protect you from it. Like, that's a little bit of the attitude in the industry. I appreciate it because on the one hand, it's saying we do a good job at safety, but it misses the fact that the reason nuclear energy is so safe has nothing to do with us. It's just because it's splitting atoms. And so when something goes wildly wrong, there's not a lot of fuel to be spat into the environment to harm us. And that's something that I actually learned it from radiation scientists, not from engineers. So part of it is that. The second issue is just that, this is a deeply traumatizing. Basically every generation except for millennials has been traumatized about nuclear weapons. For millennials, they've been made afraid of climate change. But for everybody else, it was like movies and TV shows and articles, and all of it just gave the sense that the world could end because of nuclear weapons and sort of by extension by nuclear energy, that it was apocalyptic. And here's where I think where you guys are interested in is I think that it came from the left, not the right. Why was the left so much more apocalyptic about nuclear than the right? I think there's a few reasons. The first is that the political right tended to be more affiliated with militaries and much more comfortable with kind of a military society, military culture. And a lot of the reaction against nuclear energy came from lefties who were opposed to that. I think another reason is that, it's basically a technology, it's basically a technical fix to problems that the left wanted to solve through society and politics. So, so many of our problems are just solved by moving to a better technology, right? But if you think that, like, I was talking to a friend who really sort of recognizes but hates the idea that nuclear weapons have made the world more peaceful. And I asked her, I was like, well, is it because you want to think that it was sort of due to mutual understanding? And she said, yeah, I would like to think that we ended war because we kind of all got together and decided we didn't want to have war anymore. And that was a very idealistic view, mostly on the left for a long time. And when nuclear weapons come along, it was like, yeah, well, we might very well end war, but without any of that harmonic convergence. It might just be, there's no singing Kumbaya. We just don't have war because it just became too dangerous. And I think that bothers people.
Yeah, I think that's a very good hypothesis. In terms of the practical nature of things, we've spoken about some of the disasters and those in themselves seem to be overblown in terms of risk. But you guys have some nuclear plants in California. There's obviously, Ramon's mentioned some in Germany. There's some dotted all over Europe. France runs most of its grid, as far as I understand, on nuclear. What's the actual risk? Let's say you live a couple of blocks down from the local nuclear plant. People are going to say, well, I don't want to be the person who they build a nuclear plant nearby. They're going to ruin our local town, or you're going to have this large perimeter, and there's so much radiation exposure, and then there's the risk from the nuclear waste and all of that stuff. Give us a little bit of insight into the actual risk on the practicalities of having a nuclear plant.
Well, basically, like I said, they're basically almost none. It's basically all benefits. It's funny, mostly the people that live near nuclear plants like them. And in part because the nuclear plants usually pay for the schools, or they provide some sort of local benefit in recognition of some amount of risk. It's the best deal in the world, as far as I can tell, because there basically isn't any real risk. Even if something goes catastrophically wrong, you're going to be okay. So, people sometimes go, would you want nuclear waste in your backyard? Hell yes, please. Because you're telling me you're going to give me nuclear waste, which creates absolutely zero risk for my community, and you're going to pay me? Thank you. People are like, oh, they want to dump the nuclear waste in poor communities. I was like, boy, those communities would be lucky to have it. The idea that waste, so nuclear waste, by the way, is like the most interesting of all the stories. You're just referring to these used metal fuel rods, all of which in the United States, which has the most nuclear reactors in the world, can fit on a single football field. In Switzerland, they put all their waste on a single basketball court, where it never has hurt anybody ever, and never will. We've been looking for years to find a single death from nuclear waste. Not even like somebody getting crushed by it or something. It's ridiculous. It's all about the displacement of bomb anxiety onto energy.
All right, but so cool. So nuclear waste can't hurt you. Nuclear is relatively safe. Obviously, there's always risk with everything, but it's really, really low. But people are going to say, look, nuclear is great, and that was a cool invention for the 20th century, but now it's the 21st century, and we've, solar's the new thing, wind turbines are the new thing, renewables. We really need to go with renewables. Renewables are the way to go. They're, inverted commas, a better technology. This is certainly some of the so-called common wisdom that's out there, that would be silly to go with nuclear because of all the other options. And you've already spoken about the dilute nature of renewables. But I know you've got some interesting stats and figures about how much it costs to have renewables versus having nuclear to do the same job.
Yeah, I mean, I always say just everything you need to know about energy and the environment you can learn from France and Germany. So France spends a little more than half for electricity that produces 1/10 the carbon emissions as Germany. What's the difference? France is 75% nuclear. Germany is getting out of nuclear. We have been subjected to so much hype and bullshit about solar and wind that you would think that it makes electricity cheap. It doesn't. It makes electricity expensive everywhere in the world. So over the since really, Germany is going to have spent $580 billion on renewables by 2025. During that period, its emissions will have remained flat. They will not have changed. And its electricity prices will have increased 50%. So, I mean, just kind of look at the facts. There's been so much manipulation by investment companies, by renewable energy companies, and by the environmental groups that they fund, along with natural gas companies, to basically lie to people. And I say lie because I think it's deliberate. Lie to people about the economics of renewables, lie to them about the environmental impacts. So I mean, California, we saw our electricity prices go up 5 times more than the rest of the country after we started doing a lot of renewables. Now, I was making this argument a year ago, and I was accused of mixing correlation with causation, the usual bullshit. And finally, today, I just wrote a story about the University of Chicago has just done a major report showing that, in fact, doing a lot of renewables makes electricity expensive. And the reasons are the same reasons I identified, which is that the unreliable nature of solar and wind mean you always have to have some way to back it up. And that makes the electricity very expensive. You have to build these huge transmission lines, and you need tons of land. So, I mean, it's kind of amazing. I mean, at some point, we're going to have to write the story of how the entire human race got hoodwinked, not just on nuclear, but on renewables. I mean, how did we all got sucked into this kind of scam, that the most environmentally destructive energy source was sold as the most environmentally benign, and the most environmentally benign energy source was sold as the most environmentally destructive.
Yeah, no, you're busting a lot of preconceptions I've had, I must be honest with you. But Michael, I mean, growing up as you did, you admitted that you were anti-nuclear in the past. Now you're very pro-nuclear, obviously. What has the reaction been from people in your industry? Because it's not the people are not known to be very subtle, so to speak, about their ideas and how they express them. I mean, I don't know. Have you lost friends over your views, or are you gaining new ones? How is your message being spread, and what is the reaction to it?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a big change in the last few years. I mean, I think we've changed a lot of opinions, and I think we're starting to see it in the polling data finally, in the United States at least. I mean, when people are exposed to the information on this, most people change their minds. There's about a 1/3 kind of dogmatic group of people of any population that's never going to change their mind. But most everybody else is just ignorant. They just don't know anything, and what they think they know is wrong. So it's had a big impact. I mean, I think what needs to change now is I think the nuclear industry needs to change, because at a certain level, if the industry doesn't change, then we're just limited in what those of us that are kind of independent writers and analysts, can do. Yeah, I mean, certainly lost friends, made friends. It's just kind of par for the course when you change your mind about something as important as this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And talking about ignorance, I just want to call on your favorite senator, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And you had, Congresswoman. Yes, sorry, not senator. And you said her new Green Deal is like bullshit and climate fakery. I agree completely. But how can someone like that think that something like the new Green Deal could ever hope to exist in the real world? It's not just bullshit. It's bullshit on steroids.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very difficult question. I mean, when people have, three questions for me usually, which is sort of, is it safe? What do you do about the waste? And why are people against it? And the first two questions are really pretty straightforward and easy to answer. The third question of why they're against it, it's sort of like I said, you have to kind of go through history. You have to kind of look at their ideology. I mean, I think conservatives have been right to detect that the demand for renewables is sort of a demand for power and for societal power. It's not about solving the problem. It's about gaining power over what kind of a society we want. Or at least that was the idea. I mean, the truth is that they're not going to be able to change the society because nobody wants to live like Ewoks or go back in time and live like how we lived during Game of Thrones, without the dragons. So I mean, I think that it's just at this point it's just become a kind of postmodernist fantasy, that by doing solar and wind we're going to harmonize with the natural world.
Yeah, well, Game of Thrones is more realistic than the new Green Deal.
That is for sure.
That is for sure. So I mean, I don't know if you're aware of Alex Epstein.
Sure, I know Alex.
Right. So he's been on our show, and he's made arguments that are not necessarily pro-nuclear, so to speak, but he's also very much into the allowing the technology to make people develop and acquire wealth, and when they get wealthier, they essentially pollute less and want cleaner energy and all that sort of stuff. So essentially, what you are proposing is really a sort of a capitalist response to maybe the problem caused by capitalism in the first place. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to sort of get at a little bit more clarity here, which is that it's not that we get rich and then clean up things when it comes to energy. It's more like when you're poor, you go from using wood, and when you develop, you stop using wood and you use coal. And then as you get a little bit richer and you develop your oil and gas industry, then you move to burning natural gas. And sometimes we spend more money for the natural gas, but a lot of the times natural gas becomes cheaper than coal, which is what's happened in the United States. I think that is capitalism. I think obviously price signals are really important. When you're looking at energy, though, whether a nuclear plant produces the same clean power in socialist France that it produces in capitalist Texas, I mean, and even there, it's not even obvious. It's not obvious what we're talking about when we use words like capitalist and socialist. The problem is with electricity in particular, because you don't want to have more than one company stringing up copper wire everywhere. We have a natural monopoly, just like we do for, water, cable news. I mean, not cable news, but cable television. You have a kind of natural monopoly, and that can either be run by the government, which it is in most countries. It's public utility that is controlled by voters ultimately, and by corrupt politicians when it doesn't work. Or it's a private utility that has monopoly status and is heavily regulated by the government. I can't tell the difference between those two systems. They both seem to be basically fine. I see problems with them both. Is it capitalist? Is it socialist? It's kind of like the words don't really help when trying to understand what's important when it comes to making electricity.
Yeah, it's an interesting point because, as you say, you don't want everyone stringing up copper wires all over every suburb. across the country. But it does seem as if there's starting to be bipartisan support. I mean, Ramon referred to the Green New Deal, and I think that's everyone who is half sane knows that that's a silly idea. You need to massacre all the cows so that they stop farting. You need to stop using air travel and use trains to get everywhere, including from the continental United States to Hawaii. It's there's crazy stuff in there, but there does seem to be some bipartisan support coming for nuclear. Certainly in the United States, I think that matters because a lot of the world, in terms of technology, does follow the United States. So if the US goes after nuclear for the next 20 to 30 years and ends up with a very stable, well-run power grid which provides cheap energy to people through nuclear, the rest of the world is likely to follow. What do you think the sort of obstruction is there? Because I'm sure the people who are using gas in the US, you had a good fracking industry develop over the past 10 years or so, of the past decade. I know it's dropped down a little bit now, but certainly when oil prices were higher, it did really well. It made you a net exporter of energy, of oil. Where do you think the sort of threats to embracing this technology more? You've got good South African Elon Musk promoting power walls and things like that, solar roofs. So what's your take on the chance of a good uptake of nuclear and the threats other energy industries pose?
Yeah, and I should after this call I should go because I was supposed to be meeting with somebody at 2. Yeah, I mean, the United States is a little bit different than most countries just because we have so much energy. We have like you said, a fracking revolution, abundant natural gas, and we just don't have as much energy demand as there are in developing economies, like in Africa or Asia or Latin America. So I would not consider the United States to be a high growth area for nuclear, at least in the short term. We're just trying to keep our plants that we have running. Much more hopeful, I think, is Asia, the Middle East, Africa. Those are the places that need nuclear the most. Those are the places that still, I think, have a lot of demand for electricity.
Well, Mike, thanks. As you say, you've got to get going, and I really appreciate your time for coming on the show and giving some insight. I really hope we're going to have some listeners, many of whom are anti-nuclear, will have some of their ideas challenged, and hopefully will be a bit more thoughtful about the subject in future.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Congratulations on your program.
Well, I just want to say you're very different from the guy on the TEDx stage. I like the fact that you, in a way
I hope
that's
a compliment.
Yes, very much so. It's less sanitized, and you use the word fucking bullshit a few times, which is great as well.
I knew you were a podcast, so I figured it would be safe.
Yeah, we're perfectly good with that. We're perfectly good. Obviously, we can find you on social media. So you're on Twitter.
Yep.
Just as Mark Shellenberger and Shellenberger MD on Twitter.
Yes.
And then also you write quite often for Forbes, an article just this past week. And I think that's the best place for people to find your stuff. Anywhere else?
That's it. You can find all sorts of good and bad about me online.
As always, Mark. Thank you. Thanks
all
again.
Right,
thanks so
guys.
much for your time. Cheers, eh?
Okay, take care. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Right, Ramon. So another show, another interesting guest. Hope everyone enjoyed that one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually a bit blown away by how little he finds about nuclear that we shouldn't use it. Even the corruption part, I was like, wow, that was actually cool. Not entirely persuasive because the ANC and the NDR and all that stuff, but it made me think of it.
The question is, would we, in the South African context, it's like Kusile, right? You're meant to have this running power plant, but actually it's only 20 or 30% running or whatever it is. So the problem with the nuclear is we might, inverted commas, build a nuclear plant, but actually never actually have a nuclear plant.
That's
but
problem.
Sure, if you're actually going to get it complete and done, he does make a good point. You want cheap energy that's very corrupt or expensive energy that's very corrupt. At the moment, we have a whole bunch of coal contracts that went to the Guptas. So we just have dirty energy that's corrupt as against clean energy that's corrupt.
When we have energy, Jonathan Witt, which is not all the
Good,
time.
good point. Good point.
And then let's not forget, Medupi and Kusile have cost almost R500 billion anyway, which is half the price of the nuclear deal. So we really lost, is 500 billion really, the difference we care about in terms of corruption between nuclear and the power plants that don't work anyway. That's something to consider.
Yeah, well, I hope everyone's enjoyed that podcast, enjoyed the show, enjoyed Mike's comments. And I do hope, because one of the reasons we got Mike on the show is we've been challenged on our position on nuclear previously. And it's always good to get the other perspective. So, as always, you can find us on Twitter at Renegade_report, on Facebook, the page and the group. Ramon at Roman Cabernet. Myself at Jonathan_Witt. Wow, that's a lot of Twitter and Facebook.
Right.
Please go to our page.
And don't forget our T-shirts are out on Renegade Report /.co.za/shop. We've been called anti-Semites for having a Jewish sniper training T-shirt by a Jew. So that was quite fun.
Yeah. Lots of controversy around the shirts. You're welcome to go to the website. There's a whole bunch of stuff there. We are trying to build on it and upload it. Shirts. If you enjoy the show, please donate towards it. And as always, thank you for listening. We'll catch you next time. Cheers.